So as we get started, all of you have heard references made to the Living Learning Communities That Work book that Karen and Jody and I are co-authors on with Matt Rosinski. And before we get started, last summer we were fortunate enough, at least Jody and I were fortunate enough to actually be here with the seminar participants when the book actually was published. And we do have a special reading that we want to share with you because you all, we think it will be important to your understanding of our comments today. Maybe.
LLCs are most effective when their programmatic goals and objectives are present, clear, and aligned with the LLC theme. Attention to the goals and objectives ensures LLC staff and faculty are focused and working in tandem to advance the theme of the community and help students fully integrate their academic and social experiences.
Last summer when the book arrived, Shannon's little one, Phoenix, was kind enough to read that little bit of our book. But it was, I think it represents, one, the kind of fun that we've had with all of this, but two, it's been an important, I think the book has helped us frame a number of the approaches that we've taken and given people a few things to think about along the way. And so in particular, I want to, again, sort of call out Karen and thank Karen for turning her computer around, as you heard, and sharing this model with us that we were able to take and expand on. And certainly that folks in the seminar have had a chance to make use of and at least consult in terms of their process, their research questions and thinking through some of the important elements of living learning communities. So, but we just wanted to share that with you to lighten our afternoon, our final session. So I'm going to turn it over to Kara as we talk about sort of our closing.
So as we kick off the closing, you can already tell that we have a tough task of matching Phoenix's ability to make the crowd laugh and smile. So hopefully we'll see a little bit of that. What an amazing less than 24 hours of conversations and dialogue around the research related to residential learning communities that we've had the opportunity to be a part of today. One of the things that's been so great is we've been able to come together, and again, as Jesse was saying earlier, we've come together, 4 or 5 years ago this work started, and we've had 3 years of the research seminar and looking at RLCs as a high-impact practice. Now we know that learning communities is designated as a high-impact practice, and later here in our presentation, we're going to connect how this work that we've been doing, what we've been hearing today is connecting and looking and seeing residential learning communities as a high-impact practice. I think one of the things that's been amazing being a part of the team that's up here, as long as with the collective and learning different conferences and here today, is just this multi-institutional approach to studying residential learning communities. And we have to kind of toot our own horn here with this seminar. There's a total of 8 research seminars right now through the Center for Engaged Learning. Those that have been completed and are still continuing to do research, and those that are in the next phases of hosting summer conference or summer seminars. The one thing about that makes ours unique is that this is the first one that is actually divided 50-50 amongst faculty and practitioners, and being able to come together and to actually role model and illustrate the collaboration that we talk about that's important in the best practice model. So I think throughout this session, we really are looking forward to closing out this conference today with all of you and to kind of celebrate the work and look towards the future of where residential learning community research is going. So to get us started, Karen is actually going to walk around and give each of you. Oh, you already did it. She's on top of it. All right. So she's walked around. You're going to see that everyone should have 3 pieces of paper. We would like you to take about 5 minutes to answer the following 3 questions. While you're doing that, make sure to please indicate number 1, number 2, number 3. As we're going through the presentation, Karen will actually be taking some time to set up themes of the responses to the questions. So we'll give you about 5 minutes to do that.
So you all heard a little bit last night about the motivation behind having a research seminar that's sponsored through the Center for Engaged Learning that was looking at residential learning communities as a high-impact practice. But I'm just going to refresh your memory a little bit and tell you how that led into our conference here in the last 24 hours. So the ultimate goal for our seminar was to better understand both within specific RLCs as well as across institutional contexts and different RLCs, exactly how it is that residential learning communities could be a high impact practice, and in certain cases, what could make them a higher impact practice than others. And on top of that, some of the things that we knew we had already identified as gaps in the research that was identified through the think tank that happened the year before the seminar launched, it forced us to ask questions about what makes these experiences high impact practices. How could institutions that have some RLCs but don't allow access for all students to every RLC, how could they scale up access to them, and should they, based on what we actually find out about the quality of those RLCs? How could faculty and staff contribute to the high quality of RLCs while we know they are balancing other job responsibilities? There are very few staff and faculty who are hired to do solely LLC, LLP, or RLC work. So how do they do that as an add-on, or how do they integrate that? We've talked a lot about integration, of course, in the last 24 hours, but how do they integrate that into their so-called day job to actually have a greater impact on student outcomes for those students who are participating in RLCs? And how do RLCs shape, and how are they in turn shaped by institutional culture? And I think for those of you who went to the collaboration presentation today, you probably heard a lot about how institutional culture shapes the possibilities for cross-collaboration between divisions, including, and particularly, academic affairs and student affairs.
So, as Kara had mentioned, we were looking at residential learning communities and thinking about them in terms of high-impact practices. If you're familiar with the literature, you recognize probably that RLCs are not named as a high-impact practice. Learning communities are, and we've been looking at and wanted to take a look at what's special about these residential programs that could help us to see them or potentially elevate them to being kind of high impact practices. And so, again, in the literature, it's noted that high impact practices are only high impact when done well, and that is critical. You can't just say we have residential learning communities and assume, or learning communities at all, or capstone programs, or any of the other study abroad, writing intensive courses, and assume that you have a high impact practice. It is when done well. And what makes high impact practices high impact are these elements that are on the screen. And so some of what I think we were looking at, and we would encourage you to think about, is which of these elements are you seeing in some of the research? Are you seeing in the living learning programs or residential learning communities that you are working with that could lead to others being able to view them as, in fact, high impact practices?
Okay, so now you have a bit of the context with which we are working. We have the charge for the seminar. You have the notion of what high impact practices are and what makes them effective. And so what I want to do now is give an outline for the rest of this talk, and then also really encourage participation, because what we know from the just under 24 hours that we've spent together is that there is quite a lot of expertise in the room. And we want to invite that expertise into our space so that you all leave today with a firmer understanding of what the collective knowledge is of the room. So we want to start off today by really introducing this notion of what more do we know about the model that we posited in the book. And certainly we know, and we'll talk about some new measures that we heard about for dimensions of the residential learning community and the best practices model. We will also talk about what we heard related to additional support that really affirms the dimensions of the model. And then finally, we want to return to Karen's discussion last night of this notion of research to practice, right? And the reality that the best practices model is really a research to practice model. How might it look if we flip it around and talk about how, how practice informs research informs practice? So this feedback loop that we feel is really essential to to informing the execution of the model, but also to informing the future of the model. So, like I said, we really invite discussion throughout. Certainly, you've shared some of your thoughts in your table and with Karen on the pieces of paper. But as we go through the three aspects of the outline, we would love your thoughts as well. So, with that, I'm going to turn to this notion of measurement. Right? We have thought a lot about measurement throughout the 3 years that we have been together in the RLC seminar. We've talked about why measurement is really tricky as it relates to residential learning communities. Certainly, we've heard a lot about that today. We've heard about controls and what a control is and why we need to utilize controls if we're doing quantitative work. We've talked about residential college versus non-residential college, and are we comparing the same students, or are we comparing students who are motivated differently for college? And so certainly there are some enduring questions about measurement, but the participants in the 3-year seminar have jumped into those conversations and really jumped into the fray. And all of you who presented today have jumped in as well. So you didn't let measurement scare you off, which is a really good thing, because we know that as we do it, the closer we are to precision. So I want to address a little bit about what we heard today in terms of how we actualize the research aspects of this model. We have seen that as a result of the seminar and the conference, that there are a lot of folks who are doing good work around understanding dimensions of the model. And so we saw a presentation that looked at this notion of sense of belonging and utilized the Johnson et al. Survey and to see if it fit in the model. And that certainly can help us to understand more about a socially supportive environment. We looked at self-efficacy and how students are feeling more efficacious as a result of being in a living learning or residential learning community. And that can help us understand this socially supportive environment as well as the academically supportive environment, right? If we have efficacious students, then they will likely do better academically. We were introduced to deeper life interactions and Rishi's model, or Rishi's instrument of looking at these different types of interactions, sort of surface level to deeper interactions, and does that have an effect on students in a living learning community? And what they illustrated is that certainly for peers it does. Obviously, those of you who were able to engage with the integrative learning group, saw how they applied the AAC&U integrative learning rubrics to the best practices model to see if integrative learning is happening, and there's some ongoing research related to that. And then finally, the thriving quotient and how the thriving quotient might be applied to residential learning communities as well. So, I mean, even just from a measurement perspective, we have learned quite a bit about how some existing measures can be applied to the best practices model and ultimately applied to residential learning communities. We also have looked at this notion of collaboration between academic affairs and housing. And this has been one of the seminar groups ongoing project, and I can reflect on year one and them saying, well, how do we measure collaboration? And all of us looking at them and saying, how do we measure collaboration? We don't know how to measure collaboration. And they went down a few rabbit holes to look at how they might do that, and ultimately came to the conclusion that they needed to measure collaboration in order for the rest of us to do it. And so it's really, really exciting work. So I want to pause here and ask for some comments around measurement. All of you who presented obviously have really struggled with this question as well. And so anything coming up for you related to measurement and related to kind of these enduring questions about the measurement of residential learning communities to know their effectiveness? Raise your hand and I'll give you the mic.
Oh, I can talk loud.
Let me give you the mic. Okay. Okay.
All right, so one of the things we talked about last night, and we talked about today as well in our group right now, is how we still don't even have definitions for what an RLC is. And our big debate last night was residential colleges. What do they mean? What are they? How do you define them? And we couldn't come up with a definition that worked for everybody.
That's a really important point, that until we get more precise definitions, perhaps we're measuring different things. Yeah, thanks, Joy. Other thoughts?
One thing I've been thinking about over the last day is a sense of a common understanding that we are creating and need to create about what are the outcomes that we believe RLC should provide. Because in some sense, I think that there's some similarity, but in another sense, I think that each of these studies sort of grabs on to different things. And in terms of articulating our work to people who don't necessarily buy into RLCs, I think it's really important that we somehow decide what are the outcomes, and then how are we measuring the impact on those outcomes.
Thanks, Rishi. Other questions around measurement? What other measures do we need? We talk about definitions. We talk about potentially common outcomes. Are there other measures that we need?
I wasn't going to speak to necessarily other measures, but another thing that I think complicates the work is that the things that we're measuring don't necessarily occur in isolation from each other. And so there's a whole complexity of how they interact.
Really good point. Other thoughts around measurement? What about things that can't be measured? Are there any aspects, right? When I was in graduate school, one of my instructors always used to say, well, if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist, right? So are there other ways to get at some of these enduring questions from a methodological perspective?
But the last comment struck me from an earlier conversation we had about one of the surprises was sort of like the importance of the peer-to-peer communications and how that was enhanced by a living learning community as opposed to, interactions with faculty or interactions with staff. But then I sit and think about it, and they don't occur in a vacuum. Perhaps by modeling communication with faculty and staff, they're able then to take that technique that they've observed and learned and have more effective peer-to-peer communication, which would make the faculty and staff more impactful than they might think it was through their observation. So it's a tricky thing to measure this stuff.
Thank you for that comment. It's a really good point. And I think it's a good segue into Mimi's discussion about what we've learned in terms of support for the model.
So I think Karen did a nice job last night of telling us that the model doesn't necessarily always hold up in practice, but in terms of what we were able to gather based on both the poster sessions and then the sessions today, there were a few things that stood out to us in terms of elements of the model that seem to be important and to play out in both the research and in some cases in the practice of residential learning communities. One of the things that certainly struck me was how important the academically and socially supportive climate element seemed to be, and many of you might find that that was true either in your research or if you were presenting on practice, residential learning community practice at your own institution. One of the studies indicated that more well-resourced residential learning communities could lead to better outcomes, and that was those who were studying thriving, looking at how a greater dollar amount per student seemed to result in higher levels of thriving, which is an important thing for us to be thinking about. Alignment between the clear goals and objectives and the co-curricular environment really does enhance outcomes, and I think that thinking about the question, what outcomes should RLCs provide, takes us back to that foundational level of what are our clear goals and objectives, both within an individual program that might match the environment at your institution, but then I think the bigger question was raised, and I think it's a helpful one in terms of sort of overall, are there particular goals and objectives that we think should exist or would make most sense to help further define these different types of programs? And then finally, the co-curricular activities should reflect the strengths of the environment, and recognizing that we need to take advantage of where we are and what we have to make use of. One of the things that we talked about a little bit last night was Charity's, I'm pointing in the back there, Charity's poster about the use of the local science center in order to, creating a partnership with the local science center and tapping into the K-12 outreach, which is part of the model, to create an activity and something important that the students were able to do some kind of a co-curricular and maybe even a curricular element of their course, was a great example of some of the elements of the model. And so I think what we want to highlight is that it's clear that some of this really does play out well, both in the research and in the practice. I think it's also important to note that we're not only trying to look at what supports the model, but as I said, Karen called it out right away last night. There are some realities of this, and as we talk about the research to practice part, I think we're very aware of the fact that there are some elements of this that may not be as easily put into practice as they might seem to be on the surface, or we might look at and think, oh yes, we could take care of that. So. Were there other, as you look at this model, and some of you are more familiar with it than others, and it's certainly not the only important structure to be thinking about, but were there other things that struck you as interesting connections between either what you presented or presentations that you attended, and some of these elements that we've made a claim are important in residential learning communities that kind of add to what we've noted as supporting the model?
One thing, I mean, you speak about the curricular and the co-curricular, but is there a need for a presence of the extracurricular? And how important is that in terms of developing that sense of belonging within these residential learning communities?
I think it's a good question. I think that in some ways, one might see that embedded within the socially supportive environment, but it may be more nuanced than that. And so I think that's a very good question.
So I think one of the challenges that I've had with the model is it's hard to see the residential piece in this model. It's very learning communities, but like, you see the housing down there, but you don't see the living piece. Or if you call it living learning communities or residential learning communities, the first word of those residential and living, whichever way you call it, is missing from the model. Other than the housing piece in the bottom, it's not in the co-curricular, it's not in the, that's missing from the model. So it feels very much more like a learning community and less so like a residential learning community model.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that we talked a little bit about, even as we were kind of looking at the various presentations and thinking about some of the things that maybe you saw and or presented, the question is this about residential learning communities, or is it just that whatever we were looking at, we happened to pick residential learning communities as a context, and does the residential learning community element even matter, right? Could the same thing happen anywhere else? We're studying, if we look at different concepts, could the same thing be happening somewhere else? What is the residential learning community element that really matters? And I think that you make a good point, Cliff, in terms of that environment. We have climate, but not so much environment, and context might be a little bit less clear there. So thank you.
I wanted to follow up on that to think about even the first year of the seminar or the think tank that preceded the seminar. One of the things that we had a lot of discussion about was residential learning community. So we called it Big R, Big L, or Big C. And initially when we classified our participants in the community, you probably all don't know this, we thought we tried to capture if we thought they were Big R folks, so if they were focused, their questions were most focused on the residential dimension, if they were most focused on the learning dimension, or if they were most focused on the community dimension. And I don't think that we've necessarily resolved that question. And Cliff, I think that your statement illustrates that pretty well. So I would add that as sort of an unresolved issue, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But it's something that I often, when I'm doing my research or when I'm reading research, I think about that classification schema. So I thought it was helpful, and I hope it helps you too.
I will also add that I think it was this morning in a conversation I was having with Jody, I was thinking about that classification again, and I said, it seems to me that the Big C, the community, really is a much more salient element based on all of the different presentations and posters that I saw than I even realized. And maybe in my mind that was sort of a given, but it has become very sort of in the front, for me at least, throughout the last day and a half. Any other comments, things, Jill?
One of the things on my mind is access. So who has access to the RLCs, and in terms of resources, and I think that's really critical. So at Washington University, everybody's part of a residential learning community. By de facto, that's just you enter in. So everybody has a faculty in residence. There's certain components that we have. And so the whole idea of opting in, opting out, who has access, who has the resources. And then in our study on thriving, we showed that first-generation college students showed higher signs of thriving in RLCs. I think that's compelling. We want to dig a little deeper on that. And part of that is our students do not compartmentalize their learning. We do. The institutions compartmentalize it. So when it's integrated and they have those resources available, they have the advising, the mentoring, it's all baked into where they live. They're not having to seek that out. It's just part of the fabric of them living there. That benefits our first-gen students. And so I think that that's something that I'm really curious, especially as we dig maybe a little bit deeper with some focus groups. So that's just something I was thinking of.
Thanks, Jill.
So I was just thinking about what you said about the Big R, the Big L, or the Big C. And to me, it's really all about community, and the residential part of the learning part, or the residential part and the learning part, are strategies to establish community. So at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to create communities that bond together, help each other out, and get them through the rough spots so they can complete their degrees successfully.
Thank you.
Coming back to what Cliff said also, when in our group, when we talk a lot about the academic environment, for me, the academic environment that my staff is working to create is in the residential. So when I look at that faculty advising, it's not happening in an academic building, that's happening in the residential learning community. Or when we're creating that socially, my eyesight's starting to go. I did turn over 40. We'll just say over 40 at this point. It's a couple of years beyond that. Yesterday, so my eyesight's done. But when we're creating that socially supportive and that academic environment, we're doing that, and we have curriculum set up in the residence hall to do that. And so while it says academic environment, for me, when I'm working with my staff, I'm training them from a residential perspective to create that academic environment in the residential learning community.
Thanks.
Hi, Warren Chang from Stanford University. One of the things that struck me as I'm going through a few of the presentations today and even feedback on our own Thriving presentation as it relates to the model is just the impact of student expectations, which I know the model is really about how we think institutionally about how these things should function ideally. But whether it's the presentation from Singapore about what students are expecting going in. There was some feedback about our students in terms of the South Asian students that didn't seem to be thriving, and what those students might be expecting that might be different than other populations. We heard a great piece from Elon about what they're trying to do with student athletes and what is their expectations about LLCs and how might that affect participation or engagement. And so when I think about Stanford, we have about 90 different houses, and the decisions that they are making are not really related to this. It's like which one has the sink, and which one's closest to my classes, or which one has the newer facilities, right? So I think on a very practical level, that sort of unfortunately trumps a lot of the things that we think of as creating a great environment for students. So it just reminded me how prominent some of those pieces are when we think about student expectations. Makes multi-institutional research also very difficult because each of our campuses have different expectations about what it means to be part of these things.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Shannon, who's going to talk a little bit about this idea that Karen introduced last night about research to practice.
And when I think about Karen introducing this, I think about it sounds more like research to practice. It's like, oh my God, how do we implement this? How do we operationalize this? And what does it really feel like to do this on our own campuses? And I don't know about many of you, but whenever I'm here at the seminar, whenever the four of us are talking together, and at each presentation that I went to today, and I specifically went to mostly non-seminar participant presentations today. And I kept thinking, had the constant question in my head of how could this translate to, for my case, Elon, right? How could this translate into my institution? What things might transfer and what things just wouldn't work because of the institutional context? And I ask the same kind of questions when I read their book, right? So what kinds of things might we, and with any of the research articles that are out there on learning communities and particularly residential learning communities, what kinds of things would transfer in our institutional context? And so when you're looking at this model and you're thinking about the ways in which the emerging research on residential learning communities might actually inform your practice. We know that it's extremely nuanced, and we know that one of the things that we've talked about is that the mortar here has to be flexible, right? There's no way in which that if it was solid and you push it a little bit and you smash something, right, the whole thing could come crashing down. I think that Karen had a graphic at one point of it crashing right in other presentations, and I said you should put a person underneath it to really get the impact of that, right? Because you can crush whole communities with this. But when we think about research to practice, some of the questions that remain are things like what are the contributing factors to an academically and socially supportive climate, right? So if we know that these things are important, what are the conditions at your institution, at different types of institutions, and in different types of residential learning communities that actually might facilitate that support? What kind of trainings, what kind of education has to occur for everything from the student, staff, and peer mentors to the faculty and staff who are involved in these RLCs? Do courses for credit matter? That's been a question that we've heard a lot of in the last 24 hours. And depending on the context of the institution, we may find that some people, when they're translating this research into practice, find out these courses suck. They suck for the faculty, for the staff, and for the students who are taking them. And in other institutional contexts, it's the only way that you can actually have an RLC have legitimacy and then get students to be involved in that, right? So when we think about taking research to practice, we always have to contextualize it in our own institutions, and we always have to think about the people that are in play at the bottom of this pyramid, right, when we're talking about collaboration across divisions and across departments. So how do faculty participate in ways that matter? We've heard actually a couple scary pieces of information in the last 24 hours that faculty might not matter sometimes. This is not something we want to hear, right? We want to think that faculty matter, that staff matter, that anybody who might be involved in RLCs really matter, right, for the impact that it has on student outcomes, whether they be learning, developmental outcomes, et cetera. But how do we make sure that when faculty are participating, they are participating in a way that actually has a positive impact on our students, not just neutral or negative, right? And then how does student leadership mentoring fit into the model? And when we think about student leadership and we think about peer mentoring, how are we training those students to do that? We've heard some presentations that suggest that in that environment it just happens, but we know that there is a little bit more design and intention behind how we train our students to be peer mentors, how we train them up to be, how we educate them to be leaders. What kinds of training, what kinds of education work to make those peer mentors and those student leaders effective? These are questions that still remain, and they certainly are going to be different depending on what your institutional context is, what kinds of RLCs you're working with, et cetera. So what kinds of things have you thought about today in the last 24 hours, as you've gone around to these presentations and thought, how can I translate that into practice? What kinds of things have come up for you?
Hi, Jennifer Idam at Elon. As a faculty member, I have been thinking a lot, both through the last 3 years of experience living in residence, and also it's even more cemented with a lot of the data, is how can we train, how can we guide faculty, kind of as Shannon was saying, to participate in ways that matter. So when we're inviting faculty to be involved, are we guiding them in how to interact with students? 3 years in, living in a residential learning community, I still feel uncomfortable with that new group of students that comes through. And when I'm creating dinners in this very space, and I have a room full of tables, I still want to sit at the edges because I don't know how to engage. And if I'm an expert in it, how am I training the faculty that I'm inviting to then come in and participate? Because faculty are experts in their fields. They are experts in the classroom, and faculty often feel very uncomfortable moving into a space where they don't know the lay of the land. And so one of the presentations talked about curriculum. Maybe our curriculum doesn't matter so much. Maybe we should think more about a faculty or student affairs curriculum and less about a student curriculum. Or maybe there needs to be a co-curriculum for the faculty and student affairs leadership in ways that they can engage with students in ways that matter for students. So that's one of the things that I'm definitely thinking about for my ongoing role in the neighborhood.
As the person carrying the mic, I'm going to jump in here too. One of the things that caught my attention today was Lauren's presentation this morning from UNC Greensboro, and thinking about the student voice in this and what all of these questions. We need to find more ways to involve students in the research, because her perspective really seemed to reveal some things, or students opened up to her in ways that they might not have opened up to John. But she also seemed to be asking slightly different questions that were really informative to how we might understand what was happening in that particular residential context. So with all of these questions, I'm tempted to add, and how can students help us understand how to make that transition from research to practice, as they're the ones that are living most predominantly in these spaces.
I'm thinking specifically about the collaboration piece, because that's what our group studied. I think if we really want academic affairs, housing, student affairs to truly collaborate, we have to force a paradigm shift. And so that we need to bring in other research or other theory into the dimension here to really think about how we can practically make that happen. So I think that's another piece that should be considered rather than just staying located in the current research on RLCs.
And I just wanted to really quickly backtrack to Jesse's comment and say that we probably need to, it would probably be in our best interests as faculty and staff to develop a shared language with students, instead of we talk so much about what we expect and we talk in our language, and it would probably benefit us to actually sit down at the table with students and develop a shared language where we're communicating the same thing, and not utilizing different language. And I think that we can confuse students sometimes in that way, and that we have to think about their perspective, which we might not do a lot in our research and in our conversations amongst our colleagues on campus. And even when we talk with our students, sometimes I think about the ways that I communicate things, and I'm thinking that's probably ineffective. They probably have no idea what I'm talking about. And I need to talk more of their language instead of mine. So.
Well, thank you for sharing those observations. I'm going to actually pass it down to Karen, who has been sitting here synthesizing all of your answers, and she's going to go over some of those top themes that came out.
So, is this on? Yeah. Oh, cool. So I actually want to just make two quick observations about things that were said, and then I'll actually do my job. But the first was, as a good example of talking in the student's language, in the very early parts of the NSLOP, it was later, we went on the site visits, and we were asking students in a living learning community, tell us about a time in which you, outside of class, you and your peers discussed something that was covered in a class. And they all kind of just looked blankly like, no, we don't do that. And so several conversations in the focus group later, one of the students goes, yeah, it reminds me of that time that me and my buddy were sitting in the lounge and we were thinking what the world would look like if the League of Nations had actually been successful. And so I said, so about 10 minutes ago I asked you, when have you ever discussed with your peers outside of class something that was first introduced in a class? And he looked at me and said, oh, that's what you meant? And I was thinking, and the reason this actually relates to some of the things that were written on the paper is a lot of us talked about the importance of peer interaction, and I bet that term peer interaction makes absolutely no sense to them, right? Because they don't know what that is, right? We use that, we throw it out all the time. In fact, about 10 of you wrote it on a piece of paper, right? But I don't think the students ever think of what they're doing as peer interaction. They're just hanging out with friends. Right? So that's the one thing. The other thing I think it was Cliff who said, where are the students in the model? And when you said that, I had this aha moment. I thought, oh my God, how do we forget the students in the model? And I think the reason why was when it was first made, we were so focused on trying to discuss what is the academic focus of a living learning community, right? What makes it not a theme hall or even just a residence hall? And we sort of overloaded on the academic content to the point where we forgot about student agency and how do students build their own communities as well. And so you drew me a little picture yesterday, which I've kept and I'm holding on to with dear life. And I'm going to think about, as we think about revisions of that model, how do we incorporate the student voice more into it? Because right now, you're right, it's except for that one part about the climate in the residence hall, it's really missing. So thank you. All right, so thank you all for participating in our little piece of paper exercise. Lucky for me, most of you didn't get to number 3. Made my job a lot easier. So what I thought we would do is first talk about what you thought were some of the most important things you learned and what you're taking with you, and then end with some of the enduring questions that we can discuss as a group. So in terms of most important thing you learned, I saw really 5 major buckets. The first one is talking about the best practices model and elements of that model. A lot of people just kind of talked about the model in general, but then focused in on certain blocks within it. So is the curriculum or our course is actually impactful or not? What is the importance of faculty engagement and how should faculty engage? And that in general, RLCs can be critical to sense of belonging. So that's one little bucket. The next one is importance of peers, and that came up every single time. Number 1, number 2, number 3. So this case, we were talking about the importance of social interaction and sense of community inside an RLC, as well as just importance of peer interaction. Next is diversity of programs. So some people talked about that what they learned was there's a lot of different ways you can run an RLC, as well as every institution runs them differently. So first, take note of that and don't try to copy someone else's program because it may not necessarily work in your context. And the second thing is, while it is true that RLCs are all different, we're mostly seeking the same outcomes, which is puzzling. A good question. And then the fourth bucket is research and assessment. Two different groups wrote exactly the same words, still much to learn, which I kind of liked. But yeah, well, we're never going to, thank goodness, or we'd be out of a job, right? So there's lots to learn about what is an effective RLC and what facilitates positive student outcomes. Others mentioned things they picked up, like research needs a comparison or a non-RLC sample. Good point. Another one is needs to incentivize students to complete assessments. Yeah, good point. Others talked about using some of the measures like the thriving quotient maybe in their work, and using design thinking to approach problem solving. And the last bucket under things you've learned was sort of big picture ideas. So 2 people wrote the work matters. Also, findings don't always match expectations. Good point. And research to practice is messy. Absolutely. And that there is no one definition of an RLC, which actually comes up again in 2 and 3. So I'm going to skip now to what you're taking home with you. A lot of people wrote that the very best thing that they got out of this conference was new colleagues and contacts and networks. So I hope we all take that seriously and use that. We can consider, even though this is the end of the seminar, we can keep considering how do we keep in touch with each other so that we can keep up with the good work that we're all doing. Then really the other 2 buckets were working with staff and working with students, and it was stuff about how to bridge relationships, make collaborations, things like that. And of course the students was how to get them to interact more. So now let's move back to the questions. And it seems those the 3 areas about enduring questions were related to practice, to research, and then big questions. So the practice questions, I then further subdivided, because this is what I do, is I just keep categorizing until we run out of categories, is overall questions. So there are a lot of overall questions. What are the best practices? How do we create meaningful experiences? How practical is the best practices model? How do we create inclusive environments and promote deeper interaction, especially for minoritized populations? So those are sort of more overall, how does the model work, and how do we where do we go from here in practice? Then there were a few questions around faculty involvement. How do we engage faculty best, and how do we acknowledge and reward their participation? And then there was one person, bless your heart, who said, how do we make RLC courses more impactful, since they're evidently not? So that was practice. In research, there were some not really related questions, but they all had to do with research. So why is the impact of RLC so low and small in our research? I can answer that question, actually. I always refer back to Alexander Aston, in that he reminds us that although we tend to think of college students as being extremely heterogeneous, in reality, they're actually pretty homogeneous, particularly if you're at a predominantly white institution with mostly traditionally aged students. And so the odds of actually finding environments that have a large impact on students are relatively small. If you ever look at some of the NESI data or the SERP data findings, you'll see most of that is low impact factors as well. And so don't be disheartened that RLCs are not revolutionizing college campuses. Most interventions don't. That doesn't mean we can't keep constantly striving to improve them, but don't feel badly that that's what we found. How do we do more multi-institutional research? Third question is sense of belonging correlated with attention. I can tell you the simple answer is yes. How do we generalize findings? Good question. I think C, multi-institutional research. And my very favorite is, what is principal components analysis? I kind of like that one. And then finally, some of the big questions. And I thought maybe this is how we can end. So, what is the definition of an RLC? How are they organized? And how many are there? Which kind of sounds eerily familiar with some of the questions I asked last night, right? But that might be I think this is a good way to end. This is a good learned group about this type of community, right? So who better to start this conversation than us? So with that, I throw it out to you. Pick one. What's the definition? How are they organized? How many are there? Or it could be like, Survivor. You can make allies, right? What do you think? Well, let's start with defining. How should they be defined? Which is the question related to what is an RLC.
I was thinking something I learned was...
Oh, really?
Sorry. the Delphi process. And I'm the one who asked that silly question. I don't know anything about quantitative research, so yeah, I'm always baffled by things like that. But maybe I was really intrigued by the Delphi process that one of the groups used, so maybe you could do a similar sort of thing and ask all of the experts or the folks, the practitioners and the folks who are involved, and do a Delphi process to make a definition of an RLC.
This is part of a conversation we had in the seminar lounge last night. Is also, I think, starting with the Delphi idea as well, is I think it starts also just starting with the literature. Historically, I mean, like the debate we were having with residential colleges, I mean, that is historically that has been used from Oxford, and then and we Americanized it and sort of bastardized the idea, but that's a global idea that comes back, and then so there's that debate between the two the communities that you discussed, Karen, in the beginning. So the literature gives us an idea. 60s used a different term, the 80s used a term, the 90s have used, residential learning communities, living learning communities, living learning programs, academic initiatives. So I think first a starting point is where is the historical literature to track that where the path has gone, because I think that would help us understand where we've been and why we've been and because even you gave us the idea of, I remember being part of that the Living Learning Programs conference when they changed to academic initiatives and understanding why they did it. But if you weren't part of the community, you didn't know why they changed and why the umbrella changed.
So why did it change? Because I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, why it changed is exactly why you gave the idea, because they thought it was more, academic initiatives was more umbrella.
Inclusive of other types of, so they would readily acknowledge that there's other academic programming in a residence hall that is not a living learning or residential learning community, right?
Correct, but there's also debate of whether an academic initiative, which was the umbrella term, academic initiatives or living learning programs. So even within that community, there wasn't. So, but again, that historical debate before you can get to the Delphi, but where have we been, and then try to come up to a consensus of where should we be, I think is a starting point.
I'm mindful of time, so one last question or comment, and then I'm going to turn it back to the panel for closing thoughts.
So I will say I'm new to the world of living learning communities. I've only been involved in a year or so, and I'm definitely not as familiar with the literature as many of you are here. But my question is, why does it have to be like one single definition? Can't it be a continuum? We have, a continuum of dyslexia and continuums of lots of other things in life. And so the model, when you put up the slide yesterday, it was sort of either they're going to fall under living learning communities or they're all separate. But it strikes me that that's more about a continuum that's anchored at two ends between students having no involvement and not living on campus at all and no extracurricular activities or anything, to the ones where the faculty live in the learning community itself, and then spaces all along the way.
Is it on? I just want to make one really quick comment, because it's interesting that at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where I work, we've been working on revising and kind of redefining residential learning communities or living learning communities. And I wouldn't call it a continuum, but we sort of joke about this. Last summer, we created what would be the kind of like when you buy a car and you get sort of the base model and then the next level up and next level up. And that's really what we've been sharing with our campus to help people understand, these programs, we can even have 5 different kinds of programs on our own campus. Here's what it looks like, but so it's sort of similar to this idea of the continuum, and I think that it seems to be resonating. People sort of get it. Oh, it could look like this. Oh, okay, now I see how this is different than that. So it may be a helpful way to go.
So our panel has left us with a helpful synthesis, but also more questions, which I think is actually a really exciting way to end. Please join me in thanking these folks.